What if the reason you're not healing is because you're trying to go back to someone you were never meant to be again? According to depth psychology, the self is not something we return to, it's something we uncover. Carl Jung believed that healing isn't about fixing the outer image we projected to survive, but about reconnecting with the inner, often hidden self that's always been there beneath the roles, the masks, the wounds. In this speech, we explore one of the most powerful, yet misunderstood truths. True healing begins the moment you stop trying to be who you were. Because who you were might have been surviving, but who you're becoming is ready to live. People often believe that healing is a return, a journey back to something we lost, a state of mind, a version of ourselves that we once felt comfortable inside. There's this deep craving in the soul, especially after pain, trauma, or breakdown, to get back to normal, to feel again like we did before the storm came. But the truth is, the moment you begin that chase, to become who you were, you set yourself up to remain in suffering. Because that older version of you, the one you're clinging to, wasn't necessarily whole. It was simply familiar. The mind craves the familiar. It confuses comfort with truth and safety with wisdom. But just because something is familiar doesn't mean it's real or aligned with your soul. Often, what we think of as better times were simply periods when we were better at hiding from ourselves. We had more distractions, we kept ourselves busy, we avoided the wounds, we played roles more convincingly, we wore the mask without noticing the weight of it. And so, in our nostalgia, we don't remember who we really were. The most dangerous myth is the one that tells you healing will bring you back to that if you do enough inner work, meditate long enough, read enough books, say enough affirmations, you'll suddenly find yourself re-inhabiting your old skin, your old confidence, your old energy. But that skin doesn't fit you anymore, not because you're broken, but because you've grown. That confidence may have been built on external validation. That energy might have come from over-companionship, to avoid feeling your emptiness. So what you miss is not wholeness, it's the illusion of it. We romanticize the past self because we don't fully remember the cost it took to be that person. We forget the anxiety that lived beneath the surface. We ignore the pressure to keep performing. We forget how tired we were, how often we abandon our needs just to belong, to please, to survive. When life shatters that version of us, through heartbreak, loss, or awakening, it isn't punishing us. It's inviting us to honesty. It's giving us the chance to feel what we never let ourselves feel, to know what we never let ourselves know. When you stop trying to be who you were, something subtle shifts. At first, there's fear. The ego doesn't like letting go of its definitions. It wants clarity, identity, edges it can cling to. But the soul doesn't need to be defined, it needs to be experienced. Letting go of the old self isn't a betrayal of your healing, it is your healing. Because the old self was never the real you. It was a carefully curated construction, a set of responses to your environment, shaped by what you were told, what you feared, and what you hoped would keep you safe. There comes a moment in your journey where you must choose. Do I keep chasing the ghost of who I once was, or do I dare to meet who I am now becoming? One of those paths is nostalgia, dressed as comfort. The other is truth, disguised as uncertainty. Only one will lead you to real freedom, because true healing has nothing to do with the past, it has everything to do with presence. Who you are now, with all your grief, your insight, your scars, your stillness, is far more authentic than who you once were in the blur of performance. You may not feel as energetic or invincible as you once did, but maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's maturity. Maybe now you pause before you say yes. Maybe now your body says no before your mouth does. Maybe now you recognize patterns that once consumed you. Maybe now you speak slower, feel deeper, notice more. Maybe now, instead of needing to be everything to everyone, you're learning how to be something for yourself. That is not regression. That is evolution. The world will keep trying to pull you back into that old costume. People will expect you to behave as you used to be the character they remember. But you are not a character. You are a living, breathing soul, unfolding in real time, and it takes immense courage to stop performing, to stop striving to resurrect something that never fully honored you in the first place. Healing asks you to become honest enough to grieve the loss of the persona you built for survival, and brave enough to meet the version of yourself that is finally rooted in truth. Stop asking, how do I get back to who I used to be? And start asking, who am I now, without the pressure to be anyone else? That's where your healing lives, in the space between who you thought you had to be and who you're finally allowed to become. You don't need to be fixed, you need to be revealed. And that revelation can only come when you stop chasing your past and begin arriving fully into your present. And so the moment you stop trying to be who you were is the moment you begin to truly heal. Pain has a strange way of making us question everything. When we're in it, submerged in the heaviness of it, we tend to believe that something is deeply wrong with us, that we're broken, damaged, or somehow failing at life. The moment things stop making sense, when emotions spill out and we can no longer hide them behind the mask of I'm fine, our first reaction is to think we're losing control. But what if that chaos isn't dysfunction at all? What if it's the beginning of something sacred? What if the pain isn't proof of brokenness, but rather evidence that something deeper in you is finally waking up? The truth is, pain is not your enemy. Pain is the messenger. It arrives not to destroy you, but to break down the illusions that were never meant to last. When your soul has outgrown the structure you've built your life around, pain becomes the tool that cracks it open, not as punishment, but as invitation. You aren't being punished for being weak. You're being initiated into your strength. Growth rarely comes dressed as comfort. It often arrived in the form of discomfort so persistent you had no choice but to listen. We were taught to associate emotional pain with dysfunction. Crying is weakness. Anger is unacceptable. Grief should be hidden. But every feeling we suppress festers in the dark corners of our psyche, and eventually life brings us to a point where suppression is no longer an option. That's when pain becomes overwhelming, not because it's new, but because it's been waiting for years to be acknowledged. What you're feeling now is not just today's sorrow. It's the compounded ache of everything you couldn't speak, couldn't name, couldn't bear. Pain demands presence. It doesn't allow you to remain asleep. It pulls you out of autopilot and into radical honesty. When your heart aches, you begin to ask the questions you once avoided. Who am I, really? Why do I feel so far from myself? Why does this old story still have such a grip on me? These questions aren't signs that you're falling apart. They're signs that you're breaking through. You're no longer content with the surface. You want truth. You want depth. You want to come home to yourself. And so pain becomes the catalyst. It tears away the false identity. It reveals the parts of you that you've buried beneath roles, responsibilities, and old narratives. You begin to see that the life you built was more about survival than alignment. And while survival is noble, it kept you alive. It's not the same as living. To truly live, you must begin to feel, to face, to process. That's where healing starts, not in becoming invulnerable, but in becoming willing to meet your pain face to face, without judgment. There is no growth without discomfort. The seed must break to become the tree. The caterpillar must dissolve to become the butterfly. We accept these truths in nature, but when it comes to ourselves, we resist the very process that leads to transformation. You don't grow because life is easy. You grow because life challenges you. Because it strips away everything you thought you needed until you're left with real. Pain forces you to reckon with your own depth, and that depth is where your power lives. You might not see it now, but there's wisdom in your pain. You're learning to speak the language of your own soul. You're learning how to be with yourself in the silence. You're learning that you don't need to rush to fix anything. Some wounds aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be honored, felt, understood. Healing is not about escaping pain. It's about embracing it in such a way that it no longer owns you. You give it space. You give it voice. And in doing so, you take your power back. It's easy to believe that you're behind in life because things feel hard right now. But what if this is the moment that sets you free? What if the pain is teaching you boundaries you never had? What if it's showing you truths you once feared to accept? What if it's guiding you to relationships that are real, to a life that is rooted, to a sense of self that no longer needs validation to feel whole? This kind of growth doesn't make noise. It doesn't look impressive on the outside, but it changes everything on the inside. One day you'll look back and realize this chapter, the one that felt like it was breaking you, was actually birthing the version of you that could no longer live inside the lie, the version of you that no longer trades authenticity for approval, the version of you that no longer fears being misunderstood because you finally understood yourself. So if you're in pain right now, don't rush to escape it. Don't numb it or silence it. Sit with it. Breathe through it. Listen to what it's trying to tell you. You are not broken, you are becoming. And the discomfort you feel is simply the sound of your soul rearranging itself to match your truth. Because pain is not a sign of weakness, it is the doorway to your deepest awakening. There's a quiet force within you that resists change, even when your soul is crying out for it. It doesn't yell, it doesn't scream, it whispers in the background of your thoughts, convince you to stay in what's familiar, even if that familiarity is hurting you. That force is the ego, not your enemy, but a part of you that's deeply invested in keeping things as they are. It's not evil, not malicious, it's just scared. It was built to protect you from pain, from failure, from rejection. But what it doesn't understand is that by keeping you safe, it's also keeping you stuck. The ego clings to identities, to stories, to definitions that once made you feel like you belonged. It says, this is who you are. This is what you've always done. Don't risk stepping out of line, because what if it all falls apart? And in moments when you feel call to evolve, to grow, to leave behind an old version of yourself, the ego panics. It pulls you back into the roles you've outgrown. It tells you that discomfort is dangerous. It frames uncertainty as failure, not because it wants to sabotage you, but because it equates change with death, the death of what it knows. And it would rather keep you in the suffering you recognize than lead you into the unknown that might free you. That's why, when you start healing, when you begin to unravel the lies you once lived by, the ego will resist. It will try to drag you back into old patterns. You'll feel it when you start to set boundaries and a voice inside says, you're being too harsh. You'll hear it when you choose rest over performance and something whispers, you're being lazy. You'll sense it when you walk away from dysfunction and feel guilt for prioritizing your peace. That guilt, that fear, that hesitation, it's the ego trying to hold on to an identity that can no longer carry your truth. But the ego was never meant to lead, it was meant to serve, to give structure, not to rule. And when it becomes the master of your decisions, you begin living in reaction, not creation. You start playing roles instead of being real. You start repeating the past instead of meeting the present. And it's no wonder that healing feels impossible. Because how can you truly change if you're constantly being pulled back into a version of yourself you've already outgrown? You might feel the pull to return to habits that no longer serve you, to relationships that keep you small, to beliefs that were planted in fear. That pull isn't your soul, it's your ego longing for the familiar. Because even pain, when predictable, can feel like safety. But you weren't made to live inside the loop of your past. You were made to expand, to evolve, to transcend the limitations you inherited. That expansion terrifies the ego because it can't map it, it can't define it. And so it feeds you thoughts that keep you hesitant. What if I'm wrong? What if no one understands me? What if I lose everything? These thoughts are not signs to stop. They're signs that you're stepping beyond the ego's comfort zone. And that's where real change happens. Not when you feel completely ready, but when you move forward, despite the doubt. There's a part of you that knows this, a deeper knowing beneath the noise, a voice that speaks in stillness, not fear. And that voice doesn't pressure you to return to the past. It invites you to honor where you are, to trust where you're going, to let go of who you were, so you can become who you truly are. And when you begin listening to that voice, the ego starts to loosen its grip, not because you force it out, but because you've chosen to lead with something wiser. The ego doesn't disappear overnight. It continues to show up, especially in moments of vulnerability. It will dress up as logic. It will offer you old solutions to new questions. It will tell you that nothing ever really changes, but you don't need to fight it. You only need to see it clearly, to recognize its voice and remind yourself that just because something feels familiar doesn't mean it's right. That just because fear shows up doesn't mean you stop walking. You don't owe your past self your future. Just because a version of you found safety in dysfunction doesn't mean you have to keep repeating the same cycles. You're allowed to grow beyond the identity that once helped you survive. You're allowed to rewrite the story. You're allowed to disappoint the expectations that no longer align with your truth. And the ego will try to make you feel ashamed for doing that. It will whisper that you're abandoning something essential, but you're not abandoning yourself. You're releasing the mask. You're not betraying your story. You're evolving it. There's a difference. And the more you move in that direction, the quieter the ego becomes, not because it disappears, but because it's finally been given its rightful place, not in the driver's seat, but as a companion on the journey. So the next time you feel resistance rise up, when the ego tempts you to retreat into the old version of you, pause, breathe. Remember that you are not here to stay the same. You are here to become more whole, more free, more alive than you've ever been. And that journey begins the moment you stop letting fear make your decisions. There comes a time in your healing journey when you realize that you're not trying to become someone new. You're trying to return to someone ancient within you, someone real, someone that's always been there, waiting. All this time, you've been carrying around the weight of identities, expectations, labels, and beliefs that never truly belong to you. You've worn masks to fit in, to be loved, to be accepted, to survive. You've played roles so convincingly that at some point, you started believing you were the role. And slowly, without even noticing, you forgot who you were beneath it all. But healing has a way of peeling things back, at first gently, then without apology. The layers start to shed, the need to please, the fear of judgment, the craving for approval. What you once thought were essential parts of your personality begin to fall away, and what's left feels unfamiliar, not because it's new, but because you haven't looked at it in a long time. It's not that you lost your true self. You just buried it under everything you thought you had to be. And the moment you began to stop trying so hard to become something, you start to remember. The remembering is subtle at first. You began to notice when you're speaking from your soul instead of your fear. You catch yourself choosing silence instead of performance. You feel an inner alignment when you walk away from things that once defined you. The self that emerges in these moments isn't loud. It doesn't need attention or validation. It's steady, rooted, present. And maybe you don't quite trust it yet because it doesn't match the image of who you thought you had to be. But it's real, and that's why it feels unfamiliar. Because truth often does when you've spent years living outside of it. We live in a world that rewards the mask. It celebrates the performance. It teaches us early on that success, love, and belonging come when we conform, when we perfect, when we present a version of ourselves that others can understand and approve of. But no amount of approval can ever satisfy the ache of self-abandonment. You can gain the world and still feel empty if you're not living in alignment with your truth, because it's not external achievement that brings peace, it's internal congruence. It's knowing that who you are in private matches who you are in public. It's no longer having to split yourself into pieces to be accepted. And so, healing is not about adding more. It's about removing what's false. It's not about improving yourself. It's about revealing yourself. You don't have to become more. You have to become less of what you're not. That's the paradox. The more you let go of who you think you should be, the closer you come to who you've always been. But this process isn't easy, because the masks didn't appear overnight. They were formed slowly, shaped by pain, by trauma, by the need to belong. Some of them were handed to you by your family, others by society, by past relationships, by fear. And removing them feels like death, not because you're dying, but because your illusion is. And the ego doesn't like that. It's invested in the illusion. It built its entire sense of control around who you thought you had to be. So when you began to unlearn those patterns, expect resistance, expect grief, because even identities that harm us can feel like home when they're all we've known. But beneath that grief is freedom, because once you allow yourself to stop performing, something shifts. You begin to live from your core. You stop chasing meaning and start embodying it. You stop waiting for permission and start giving it to yourself. The choices you make come from inner clarity instead of external pressure. You start saying no when your body tightens. You start saying yes when your heart expands. You begin to live not for the applause, but for the quiet integrity that no one sees, but you can feel. You don't need to be fixed. You were never broken, only buried. Your wholeness is not something you achieve by striving. It's something you uncover by being honest. And honesty takes courage. It means facing the parts of you that are still clinging to the lie. It means feeling the discomfort of letting go. It means trusting that who you are, beneath the mask, is worthy, even if no one claps for it, even if some people leave, even if the world doesn't understand. Not everyone will recognize you when you live from your truth. That's okay. You didn't come here to be understood by everyone. You came here to remember yourself. And the self you're remembering doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be honored, protected, lived. You were never meant to shrink yourself into the versions others could accept. You were meant to rise into the fullness of who you already are. And every time you choose to drop the performance, to stop pretending, to stop trying to be who you were, you take one step closer to that self, the one that has been waiting all along. Because the real you was never lost, only forgotten. And now, you're finally remembering. There's a quiet moment in every healing journey when you realize the most powerful thing you can do is let go. Not with bitterness, not in rage, not even in despair, but with clarity. To release the version of yourself you've clung to for so long is not weakness, it's the greatest act of courage. That self, the one you built in response to pain, rejection, fear, or survival, it served a purpose. It carried you through times when you didn't know how to cope. It helped you navigate a world that demanded masks, personas, and strength, when all you really wanted was to be held in your vulnerability. And yet, the longer you hold on to that version of yourself, the more it begins to weigh you down. It becomes less of a support and more of a prison. There's nothing wrong with that old self. It's just tired. It's done its job. It has carried the weight of your expectations, your wounds, your hopes. But healing isn't about patching up the old self to make it work again. It's about recognizing that you don't have to keep dragging that version of you into every new chapter. You can thank it, honor it, love it, and still let it go, because the person you were is not the person you are becoming. This release isn't sudden, it's a slow unraveling, a daily choice to no longer participate in what doesn't serve your truth. At first, it feels strange, even disloyal. You'll feel a tug to return to what's familiar, how you used to think, how you used to react, how you used to prove yourself to the world. But the self you're stepping into doesn't need to be proven, it just needs to be lived, and that means making peace with the past without dragging it into the present. Letting go doesn't mean erasing your history, it means owning it without letting it define you. You can carry the wisdom, the lessons, the scars, but you no longer have to carry the identity that came with them. You're allowed to be someone new, not because the old you was wrong, but because you've outgrown who you had to be in order to survive. That's the sacred threshold where transformation lives, the moment you stop fixing and start shedding. You'll know you're stepping into this space when the need to explain yourself begins to fade, when your silence speaks more than your defense, when peace becomes more important than being right, when you start choosing presence over performance. The old self will beg for control, for certainty, for proof. It will whisper that you are letting go of too much, that you won't recognize yourself on the other side. And that voice isn't lying, it's true. You won't recognize yourself, but not because you're becoming less, because you're becoming more honest, more whole. Letting go isn't passive. It takes incredible strength to loosen your grip on an identity that made you feel safe, especially when you built your self-worth on it, when your ability to be loved seemed tied to that version of you. But love isn't meant to be earned through performance. Real love meets you in your rawness, in your becoming, in your truth. And sometimes, the only way to find that kind of love, both within and around you, is to release the fear that you won't be accepted without the mask. There is grief in this process. Of course there is, because you're saying goodbye to parts of yourself that got you through. And grief always follows goodbye. You'll mourn the innocence, the ambition, the energy, the way you once looked at life before everything changed. But what you'll gain in return is something far more lasting, a relationship with your soul that is rooted in truth, not survival. When you stop trying to fix yourself, when you stop trying to return to who you used to be, something radical happens. You begin to trust the present. You stop needing to control every outcome. You begin to soften, not because you're weaker, but because you're wiser. You understand not every ending is a failure. Some endings are simply the universe's way of making room for something more aligned. And when you stop fearing those endings, you start to see them as part of a greater unfolding, one that's always leading you back to your essence. This doesn't mean you'll never feel lost again, or that you won't occasionally long for the old days, or the old you. But even that longing is part of the process. It's the echo of who you were, reminding you how far you've come. And the more you step forward, the less you'll feel the need to look back, not because you're trying to forget, but because you're finally ready to live. So if it feels like you're being called to let go of a version of yourself you've known for years, trust that calling. Trust the quiet nudge that says, you're not that person anymore. And if you don't know exactly who you're becoming, that's okay. You don't need all the answers right now. All you need is the courage to release what no longer fits. Because the version of you that served its purpose does not need to walk with you into the next chapter. There comes a point in your healing journey when you finally stop asking how to get back to who you were, not because you have found every answer, but because you've discovered a more important truth. You were never meant to return. You were meant to emerge. Something shifts when you realize that your old self and your becoming self cannot coexist in the same space. One must make room for the other. That realization can be unsettling. It can feel like standing in a doorway between what's familiar and what's unknown, wondering if you're doing the right thing. But the truth is, the moment you began to trust what's unfolding now, without needing it to match the past, you've already started to heal in the most honest way possible. We often believe healing is a destination, a point in time when the pain is gone and clarity replaces confusion. But healing isn't a final moment. It's a continuous integration. It's not something that lives in the distance. It lives in the now. It lives in your choices, in your pauses, in your ability to be present with yourself without trying to control what comes next. The old self relied on structure, labels, performance, and coping strategies. It needed a plan. It needed certainty. But the deeper you go into healing, the more you realize the present doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be experienced. We don't often talk about how hard it is to release the version of ourselves that was built for survival. That version is organized, consistent, and predictable. It gets things done. It follows rules. It makes others comfortable. But it's also the version of you that didn't have space to rest, that didn't know how to say no, that couldn't admit it was in pain without feeling weak. When you begin to grow beyond that, you don't just lose parts of your old self. You lose the illusion of control. And that's what makes this so challenging. Not the healing itself, but the surrender it requires. Surrender isn't about giving up. It's about no longer forcing life to look the way it once did. It's about allowing the self that's emerging to breathe, to take up space, even when it doesn't look polished or impressive or clear. Because this version of you doesn't perform. It just is. And that kind of authenticity is powerful. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply knows its worth in silence, in stillness, in presence. You may still have moments where you feel the urge to go back, to reclaim old patterns because they felt easier, to rekindle relationships that no longer align because they gave you a sense of identity, to seek out distractions that numbed the uncertainty. But each time you feel that urge, you now carry the awareness to pause and ask, is this taking me forward or pulling me back? That question alone is growth, because once you can recognize the pull of the past, you're no longer ruled by it. You're learning how to stay with yourself in discomfort, to stay grounded when emotions rise, to stay patient when clarity doesn't come immediately, and in that staying, you're healing, not into what was, but into what is becoming, because real wholeness doesn't come from returning to a former version of you. It comes from embracing the complexity of who you are now, with your wounds, with your insights, with your softbox and your strength. It's all a part of your becoming. When you stop chasing your old self, you give space for something much more real to unfold. You begin to understand that your worth is not in how well you recover your past identity, but in how honestly you meet your present one. The habits you once used to cope may no longer serve you. The relationships you once prioritized may no longer resonate. Even your dreams may evolve. This isn't regression, it's realignment. Your soul is shifting, not because you're failing, but because you're finally listening. There's a quiet wisdom in letting life change you without resistance, in allowing yourself to not know exactly where it's all going, but trusting that it's leading somewhere more aligned. The self you're stepping into doesn't need to justify its becoming. It simply trusts the process. It knows that you don't have to rebuild what once was. You only need to be present for what is here now. This is where true healing happens, in the space where you are no longer trying to resurrect who you were, and you are no longer afraid of who you're becoming. It's subtle, it's sacred, and it's not something the world will always understand, but you will. You'll feel it in your breath, in the way your body relaxes when you stop performing, in the way you stop needing to explain your journey to anyone else. You don't owe the world a version of yourself that no longer exists. You owe yourself the freedom to be here now, to be who you are, not who you were. And when you allow that, when you surrender to the moment, without needing to shape it into the past, you don't just heal, you become whole. And in that wholeness, you finally remember that the present is not what you must fix. So no, you don't need to go back. You don't need to fix, perfect, or resurrect the version of you that once felt safe. That chapter is closed. What stands before you now is not a return, it's a revelation. The real healing begins the moment you choose to stop chasing the past and start honoring the truth that's unfolding within you. Watch the next video, because your evolution deserves to be witnessed, not silenced.